Hi guys, tonight we step quietly into a winter that does not welcome you. You wake before dawn, not because you're rested, but because the cold has worked its way through layers of wool and straw and found the spaces your body could not fully protect. Your breath appears instantly, a pale cloud hovering above you, hanging for a moment, before dissolving into the darker air. Outside nothing moves quickly. Sound itself seems slowed, thickened by frost. Even the idea of morning feels tentative. It is December of the year 1198, and Christmas is approaching. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights, because the world you are in has very little light to spare. You lie there listening. Somewhere nearby, wood contracts with a sharp crack as the temperature drops again. A muffled cough leaks through a wall, built more for keeping rain out than warmth in. Animals shift in their sleep, their bodies valuable, not for affection, but for the heat they quietly give off through the night. The smell of damp straw smoke residue and unwashed wool blends into something familiar, almost comforting in a way that only necessity can make comfort. Christmas is close enough to feel, but far enough that you cannot yet relax into it. In 1198, winter across much of Europe has been unusually severe. Modern climatologists would later point to this period as part of a broader cold phase with longer winters and shorter growing seasons. A mainstream historical fact that quietly underpins everything you are about to experience is this: harvests from the previous autumn were poor in many regions, leaving stores thinner than anyone would like to admit. Grain bins were counted carefully. Salted meat was rationed. Even monasteries, often better supplied than villages, felt the pressure of scarcity. You pull your cloak tighter and think not for the first time about food. Advent has already begun, and with it the Church's expectations of restraint. You are meant to fast, or at least reduce what you eat in preparation for the feast of Christmas. On paper, this sounds spiritually elevating. In practice, during a winter like this, it feels like an endurance test layered on top of an already unforgiving season. Many people quietly bend the rules, stretching definitions, finding loopholes that allow survival without open defiance. Scholars still debate how strictly these fasting rules were actually observed by ordinary people, especially in years when hunger was already a constant companion. Outside, the sky lightens slightly, though the sun remains hidden behind thick cloud. Snow from earlier storms lies hardened, now its surface crusted and sharp. Paths through villages and fields have been worn into narrow channels, packed down by countless careful steps. Every movement requires attention. A slip could mean injury, and injury in winter is no small thing. You rise slowly, joints stiff, feet protesting as they meet the frozen ground. The floor steals heat instantly. You pause, letting the discomfort pass, reminding yourself that everyone around you is doing the same thing in their own small spaces, wrapped in their own versions of resolve. There is work to do, even now. Animals need tending. Fires need coaxing back to life from stubborn embers. Water must be fetched before it freezes solid or broken free with effort, if it already has. The cold does not excuse you from routine. If anything, it demands more discipline, more attention, more quiet cooperation between people who might otherwise prefer distance. A quirky detail that often surprises modern listeners is how early medieval households woke during winter. Without artificial lighting to stretch the day, people followed a rhythm closer to the sun, even when the sun barely made an appearance. Nights were long, but they were not always spent entirely asleep. Many historians believe people experienced a segmented sleep pattern, waking in the deep night for prayer, conversation, or simple rest before sleeping again. In winters like this one, those quiet waking hours could feel especially heavy, filled with listening and waiting. As morning settles into its dim routine, the presence of Christmas begins to surface in subtle ways. A sprig of evergreen tucked into a doorway, a faint hum of a hymn practiced under someone's breath, the knowledge that for one day at least the rules will ease, the fast will end, the table will hold more than survival requires. But that day is not today. You step outside, breath catching again at the shock of air colder than the space you left behind. The landscape feels stripped down, honest in its severity. No leaves, no birdsong, just wind distant, steady, and the occasional human sound deliberate and measured. This is not the kind of cold that dramatizes itself. It does not howl constantly or bury everything in fresh snow. It settles, it persists, it waits for mistakes. People in 1198 do not talk about weather the way you might with forecasts and percentages. They talk about it as a force with intention, a test, sometimes a punishment, sometimes simply a reminder of human limits. Sermons during winters like this often leaned heavily on endurance and humility, drawing connections between physical hardship and spiritual refinement. Historians still argue whether such messaging offered genuine comfort or simply reframed suffering in a way that made it easier to endure without resistance. As you walk, you notice how sound travels farther now. A hammer striking wood echoes longer than it should. Voices carry across open ground with unusual clarity. The cold holds everything, tightly refusing to let noise fade quickly. Even your own footsteps feel louder, more intrusive. Somewhere ahead, a bell rings slow and deliberate, marking an hour that feels both important and arbitrary. Time moves differently in winter. Days blur together. Christmas stands out less as a sudden event and more as a brief pause in a long stretch of effort. You think of the feast that is coming, not in terms of abundance exactly, but in contrast, a meal that acknowledges survival, a table that says quietly, "We are still here. We made it this far." For now, though, there is only the cold morning, the thin light, and the steady preparation that defines life in this season. You keep moving because stopping invites stiffness, and stiffness invites problems you cannot afford. As the village stirs around you, each household lighting its own small fire against the vast winter pressing in, Christmas remains just out of reach, close enough to shape behaviour, distant enough to demand patience. And patience, like warmth, is something you learn to ration carefully. You carry the cold of that first morning with you as the days slide forward, each one feeling much like the last, yet subtly heavier. This is the year people will remember as the winter that refused to loosen its grip. Even those who have lived long enough to trust patterns feel uneasy now because the usual signs have failed them. Thaws do not arrive on time. Snow hardens instead of melting. The ground stays locked, unyielding, beneath boots and hooves. Across much of Europe in 1198, the climate has turned against expectation. Chronicles from monasteries and towns mention frozen rivers that normally flowed freely and fields left untouched long past the season when ploughs should have returned. One well-established historical observation is that extended cold like this disrupted agricultural cycles, compounding the effects of already modest harvests. When winter stretches on, it does not simply pause life, it quietly rearranges priorities. You feel it in the way conversations turn practical. How much grain is left, which animals can be spared, whether the road to the nearest market is still passable, or if it has become too dangerous to risk. Cold weather has a way of narrowing focus, pressing thought inward toward immediate needs. The sky remains stubbornly low and grey, as if it has decided to rest there for the season. When snow falls, it does so without drama, a slow accumulation that seems manageable until it suddenly is not. When it does not snow, frost creeps instead, coating everything in a fragile white sheen that crunches underfoot. Each morning brings a small inventory of damage: a cracked jug, a frozen latch, a water trough that must be broken open again. People speak about the cold as if it were an entity with its own temperament. It is blamed for illness, for bad moods, for arguments that might otherwise have passed quietly. Children are warned not to linger outside, not because of danger in the modern sense, but because prolonged exposure steals energy, and energy is precious. Elders wrap themselves in layers that smell faintly of smoke, and age sitting close to hearths that never seem quite warm enough. There is an odd psychological effect to winters like this. Time stretches. Days feel long, yet memory compresses them afterward into a single impression of cold and waiting. Medieval writers often described harsh winters as trials sent to test communities, though historians still argue whether these descriptions reflected widespread belief or were shaped by religious frameworks imposed after the fact. Either way, the cold takes on meaning beyond temperature. It becomes narrative. A curious detail, sometimes mentioned in records from this period, is the way frozen ground affected burial practices. In some regions, graves could not be dug at all until a thaw arrived. Bodies were kept temporarily in outbuildings or beneath packed earth, a practical solution that carried emotional weight. It served as a constant reminder that winter disrupted even the most fundamental rituals. Christmas, a celebration of birth and renewal, approached against this unsettling backdrop. Fuel becomes as important as food. Wood piles shrink faster than expected, and the quality of fuel matters. Damp wood smoulders uselessly, producing smoke without heat. Peat, where available, burns longer, but with its own sharp scent. Dried dung, especially from cattle, is shaped and stacked carefully, an unglamorous but effective source of warmth. The presence of these fuels stacked against walls or near doors becomes a visual measure of security. As you move through the village, you notice fewer people lingering outdoors. Tasks are completed efficiently, conversations kept brief. Even greetings are shorter words, puffing out in white bursts before being swallowed by the air. The cold discourages excess. It trims behaviour down to essentials. This winter also sharpens awareness of inequality. Some households have thicker walls, deeper stores, more animals. Others count days by what remains. It is not yet desperation everywhere, but anxiety settles unevenly. You feel it most strongly in the silence that follows mention of the future. No one wants to speculate too far ahead. A small but telling habit develops during winters like this. People listen more carefully for changes in the wind, for dripping water that signals a brief thaw, for birds returning earlier than expected. These signs are read with hope. Sometimes too much hope and disappointment follows when they amount to nothing. The cold teaches caution, even in optimism. Modern researchers, looking back, have connected winters like that of 1198 to broader climatic shifts, including variations in solar activity and volcanic events that may have altered atmospheric conditions. Such explanations, of course, would mean nothing to you here. All you know is the feel of cold stone under your palm, the way breath stings the back of your throat, and the quiet calculation that accompanies every decision. As Christmas draws closer, the tension between endurance and expectation grows. The feast is imagined again and again, not as indulgence but as relief. A pause, a proof that the year has not completely defeated you. Yet the cold threatens even that. Meat freezes too hard. Dough refuses to rise. Fingers lose dexterity, turning simple preparation into effort. Still, people persist. There is a resilience that surfaces only under pressure. Neighbours share small strategies: how to insulate a wall with extra straw, how to position animals to block drafts, how to stretch a stew by timing when ingredients are added. These are not written down. They are exchanged quietly in passing, woven into daily life. A fringe anecdote from this era tells of villagers marking particularly brutal winters by carving notches into door frames or beams, a private record of survival. Whether widespread or symbolic, the idea captures something true. Winters like this are not easily forgotten. They leave marks, physical or otherwise. Night falls earlier than you want it to. Darkness arrives with a sense of finality, as if the day has been cut short rather than concluded. Candles are used sparingly. Firelight flickers across walls, exaggerating shadows. Stories are told, more often partly for comfort, partly to pass time that feels heavier in the dark. As you prepare for another night Christmas now only days away, the cold feels almost personal. It has followed you everywhere, shaped every action. And yet beneath the layers of discomfort, there is a steady resolve. People have endured winters before. They will endure this one too. The frost may not break, but something else holds firm. By the time Advent reaches its later days, you begin to notice how completely winter has reshaped the rhythm of the village. Time no longer feels divided by tasks so much as by light and darkness. Morning is whatever brief grey interval allows work to be done outdoors. Afternoon is a slow fading. Evening arrives early and stays long. Advent, in theory, is a season of anticipation and restraint. In practice, during a winter like this, it becomes a careful balancing act. You're expected to prepare spiritually for Christmas, while also preserving enough strength to make it there. The church calendar still matters, but survival has a quiet authority of its own. You walk past houses where doors remain closed longer than usual. People stay inside when they can, conserving heat, conserving energy. When doors do open, it is often just wide enough to pass through, quickly letting as little cold air in as possible. Even greetings feel hushed, as if raised voices might waste warmth. Inside these homes, space is used differently now. Families cluster closer together, not out of affection alone, but necessity. Benches are pulled nearer to hearths. Sleeping arrangements tighten. Children who might normally sleep apart are brought closer, layered together under shared coverings. The smell of bodies, wool, smoke, and food hangs thickly in atmosphere that would feel oppressive in summer, but now signals safety. A widely accepted historical observation is that medieval homes were not designed to be warm by modern standards. Heat was localized, uneven, and precious. You feel this acutely as you move from room to room, stepping from a relative warmth near the fire into pockets of cold that settle along walls and floors. Even indoors, winter is never fully kept out. Advent fasting continues, though interpretations vary. Some households adhere, strictly eating simpler meals, avoiding meat except on permitted days. Others make quiet adjustments, adding broth where rules might suggest abstinence. It is here that lived religion diverges gently from official doctrine. Historians still debate how universal strict fasting truly was, especially among labourers whose caloric needs did not diminish simply because the calendar demanded restraint. You notice how food is prepared with an eye toward both economy and symbolism. Porridge appears more often stretched thin but warm. Bread is baked carefully, loaves counted and apportioned. Small indulgences are saved, not consumed immediately, but held back as markers of the coming feast. A bit of dried fruit, a knob of fat. These are not luxuries in themselves, but their timing gives them meaning. Outside, the village takes on a muted appearance. Decorations are minimal. Evergreen branches appear in doorways, and churches valued not for brightness, but for their stubborn life in a dead season. Holly, ivy, pine, whatever can be gathered without too much effort, is brought inside. The green stands out sharply against stone and wood, a quiet reassurance rather than celebration. Sound behaves differently in these days. You hear less of the casual noise that fills warmer months. Instead, there are purposeful sounds: chopping wood, the low murmur of prayer, the scrape of pots, wind threading its way through gaps in buildings. At night, when everything stills, even distant noises feel close, intimate, almost intrusive. Children experience Advent with a mix of impatience and weariness. They understand at least vaguely that Christmas is coming, but they also feel the cold more sharply. Their smaller bodies lose heat faster. You see them wrapped in layers, cheeks reddened, movements quick and restless. Play is shorter now, constrained by weather and watchful adults. Yet even here, imagination persists. Games are adapted to indoor spaces. Stories grow longer. A small but fascinating detail from this period involves the use of candles during Advent. Wax was expensive, and candles were often saved for Christmas itself. During Advent evenings, households relied more heavily on firelight or crude tallow lamps. The gradual increase in light on Christmas carried symbolic weight, felt physically as well as spiritually. It was not just metaphor, it was brighter. You feel Advent nights stretch on each one similar, each one slightly heavier. Fatigue settles in layers much like the clothing you wear. Still, there is a steady undercurrent of expectation. Preparations continue, however modest. A table scrubbed a little more thoroughly, utensils set aside, recipes discussed quietly adjusted to available supplies. The church becomes a focal point during these weeks. You attend services more often, partly out of devotion, partly because it offers warmth, both physical and communal. Inside voices blend in chants and prayers, breath visible in the cold air. Stone walls hold the chill, but bodies packed together create a shared warmth that feels almost ceremonial. Advent in 1198 is not festive in the modern sense. There are no bright lights, no abundance, no sense of ease. Instead, it is a season of waiting sharpened by cold, waiting for Christmas, waiting for relief, waiting for winter to loosen its hold. And yet beneath the fatigue and restraint there is something steady, a collective understanding that this waiting has purpose, that endurance itself is a form of preparation. Each day survived adds weight to the coming feast, not in quantity, but in meaning. As you return home under a darkening sky, Advent feels less like a countdown and more like a test, one you are determined quietly to pass. You approach the church before you feel ready for it, your steps slowing as the stone structure rises out of the grey morning. Even from a distance, it looks cold. Not abandoned, not hostile, just utterly indifferent to the needs of the bodies that will soon gather inside. Its walls are thick, ancient, built to endure centuries, not to comfort those passing through a single winter. When you push the door open, the sound echoes longer than expected, bouncing off stone and returning to you softened but persistent. The air inside is colder than you hoped. Not quite as cold as outdoors, but close enough to remind you that this space has been holding winter all night. Your breath shows immediately. So does everyone else's. Churches in 1198 are not heated spaces. This is a simple, widely acknowledged reality of medieval life. Fires are not lit inside sacred buildings, both for practical reasons and symbolic ones. Smoke would stain walls and ceilings. Flames carried risks no one was willing to take. More importantly, discomfort was often seen as appropriate, even desirable during worship. You are not meant to forget the physical world here. You are meant to bring it with you. You find a place among the others standing, rather than sitting, because standing keeps your blood moving. Feet ache against frozen stone floors. Knees stiffen quickly. You shift your weight subtly, hoping no one notices. Around you, bodies cluster closer than usual, a quiet negotiation of shared warmth that no one openly acknowledges. Sound behaves differently inside the church. Voices are muted, absorbed by stone. When the priest speaks, his words travel slowly, lingering in the air. Chanting fills the space in a way that feels both enveloping and distant. It is not dramatic. It is steady, familiar, the kind of sound that asks nothing from you except presence. A detail often overlooked in modern imagination is just how much cold defined religious experience in winter. You do not kneel for long without feeling it. You do not stand without your muscles protesting. Worship becomes as much about endurance as devotion. This physical strain is not accidental. Many sermons from the period emphasize the value of bodily discomfort as a reminder of humility and shared human weakness. Candles flicker along the walls, their light thin but purposeful. Wax is precious. Each flame feels deliberate. You notice how people position themselves to take advantage of it, not for warmth, but for visibility. Faces glow briefly, then recede into shadow. The rhythm of light and dark feels almost meditative. You listen though, so your attention drifts, at times pulled toward sensation. The cold creeping upward from your feet, the stiffness in your fingers, the sound of someone nearby breathing more heavily than the others. These are distractions, but they are also grounding. You are fully present because your body insists on it. Some historians point out that winter services likely felt longer than those held in warmer months, not because they were actually extended, but because discomfort altered perception. Time stretches when you're cold. Minutes feel heavier. The structure of the service becomes a sequence of small goals. Endure this prayer. Shift quietly during the hymn. Warm your hands briefly by rubbing them together when no one is looking. A lesser-known custom in some regions involved people bringing small heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth to church held discreetly during services. Whether this practice was widespread or occasional remains uncertain, but the idea itself makes sense. People adapted quietly, respectfully, finding ways to survive ritual without abandoning it. As the service continues, your thoughts drift to Christmas, to the promise of warmth, even if temporary, to the idea of gathering again in the same space but with more light, more sound, more bodies packed together. The contrast gives the day its power. Without this cold restraint, the feast and celebration would lose their edge. When the service ends, movement resumes slowly. Stiff joints protest. Doors open, releasing breath and sound into the open air. Outside, the cold feels sharper for having left it briefly behind. Yet there is also a subtle sense of cohesion. You stood together. You endured together. That matters. Church in winter is not comforting in the modern sense. It does not soothe, it steadies. It reminds you that hardship is shared, structured and bounded by ritual. There is a beginning, there is an end. Even cold has limits, though you cannot yet see them. As you walk away, the sound of the door closing behind you echoes once more, sealing the stone building back into its quiet vigil. Christmas draws nearer. The church will wait holding its cold, ready to receive you again. You feel hunger differently during Advent in a winter like this. It is not sudden, not dramatic. It arrives quietly, settling into the background of your thoughts and staying there, a low, persistent presence that shapes decisions without announcing itself. Your stomach tightens, then loosens, then tightens again, as if learning to live with less. The church's expectations are clear enough. Advent is meant to be a season of restraint. Meals should be simpler. Meat is limited. Excess is discouraged. In warmer years, this discipline might feel manageable, even symbolic. In the winter of 1198, it feels sharper. Calories are warmth. Food is fuel. Reducing either carries consequences that are felt almost immediately. Most surviving records from this period agree on one thing. People did not stop eating during Advent, but they changed how and what they ate. You notice this shift in your own routine. Portions grow smaller, meals stretch thinner, broths replace stews, bread is sliced more carefully. Fat, when it appears, is used strategically, saved for moments when strength is most needed. You sit near the hearth bowl, cupped in your hands, letting the warmth soak slowly into your fingers before you drink. The liquid is thin but hot-flavoured, more by salt and habit than abundance. It does not satisfy hunger so much as quiet it, pushing it just far enough away to let you continue the day. There is a strange intimacy to this kind of eating. Everyone notices. Everyone knows. No one comments directly. Hunger is shared, and shared hunger carries its own etiquette. Complaining feels pointless. Boasting would be cruel. Silence becomes the safest language. Religious instruction emphasizes patience and preparation. Sermons remind you that Christ was born into hardship, that discomfort brings spiritual clarity. These messages resonate differently when your body is already taxed. Some people find strength in them. Others quietly reinterpret them. The line between devotion and practicality becomes thin. Researchers looking back have noted that fasting rules were often adapted to local conditions. Bishops and parish priests sometimes offered informal allowances during extreme weather, though these were rarely written down. Whether such flexibility was widespread remains open to interpretation. What is clear is that survival often took precedence over strict observance, even if that truth was acknowledged only privately. You notice how meals become more communal during this time. Food is shared in ways that blur household boundaries. A ladle of soup passed through a door, a loaf split between neighbours. These gestures are not framed as charity. They are reciprocal investments. Everyone understands that roles may reverse before winter ends. A small but telling detail appears in how people eat more slowly. Each bite is chewed thoroughly, not out of etiquette, but necessity. Stretching a meal becomes an unconscious skill. You become attuned to texture, temperature, timing. Warm food eaten slowly provides warmth longer. This is knowledge learned through repetition, not instruction. Children feel the fast in their own way. They ask questions, they watch adults closely. You see them hovering near cooking pots, hoping for scraps, their energy dipping and surging unpredictably. Adults respond with distraction rather than explanation. Stories are told, tasks are assigned, hunger is redirected where possible. Despite restraint, there is also anticipation. Certain foods are deliberately withheld, saved for Christmas. A piece of cured meat hangs untouched. A small sack of dried fruit remains tied shut. These are promises made visible. You pass them, daily reminders that the fast has an end. The cold complicates everything. Hunger feels deeper when your body is working constantly to stay warm. You notice how quickly energy drains when you spend time outdoors, how your hands shake slightly when you return inside, how rest feels heavier, less refreshing. Eating becomes less about pleasure and more about function. Yet there are moments of quiet satisfaction. A shared meal, however modest, brings a sense of order. Bowls set out, people seated. The routine itself offers comfort. In a season defined by uncertainty, predictable meals anchor the day. Some accounts from this era mention people flavouring food more heavily during winter, using salt herbs or whatever spices were available, not to enhance luxury, but to create interest. Taste becomes a small pleasure that costs little. Even bitterness or sharpness is welcomed if it breaks monotony. As Advent progresses, you find yourself thinking less about hunger as a problem to be solved and more as a condition to be managed. This mental shift is subtle but important. Acceptance reduces strain. The body adapts, the mind follows. There are evenings when you go to sleep with hunger still present, but quieter now, dulled by fatigue. You wrap yourself tightly, aware that sleep will slow everything further. Dreams come easily, often involving food, warmth, abundance. You wake without surprise when those dreams dissolve into cold reality. And yet Christmas approaches. The knowledge changes everything. Hunger becomes purposeful. The fast gains structure. Each day endured adds weight to the coming feast, not in quantity, but in meaning. You do not starve, you endure. And endurance in this winter is its own form of nourishment. Markets do not disappear in a winter like this, but they change character. You feel it the moment you approach the open space where stalls usually gather. The ground is hard and uneven, its surface scarred by frozen ruts and packed snow. Footsteps crunch sharply, each one sounding louder than it should. People move carefully, not lingering, not browsing in the leisurely way they might in warmer months. Trade continues because it must. In 1198, most towns and villages still rely on regular market days to redistribute food and goods. This is not optional. Households depend on what arrives here, especially when their own stores run low. What changes in winter is not the need for markets, but their rhythm. Fewer sellers appear. Goods are simpler. Conversations are shorter and more purposeful. You scan the offerings with a practiced eye. Grain appears in small quantities, measured precisely. Flour is kept tightly wrapped, protected from damp air that could ruin it. Vegetables are mostly roots, now pulled from storage rather than soil. Onions, turnips, leeks, anything that can survive months underground. Fresh greens are rare, treated almost like curiosities when they do appear. Meat is present but not plentiful. Salted pork, smoked fish, the occasional bird. Prices feel higher, though money itself often takes a backseat to barter. A bundle of firewood exchanged for bread. A piece of cloth traded for grain. Coin circulates, but trust and reputation matter just as much. Contemporary accounts consistently show that winter markets leaned heavily on preserved foods. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were not emergency measures. They were planned responses to exactly this season. You are reminded standing there that what feels like scarcity is often the result of careful long-term calculation. Supplies were never meant to last comfortably. They were meant to last barely enough. The cold affects more than inventory. It shapes behaviour. Sellers keep their hands wrapped or tucked inside sleeves, working quickly to avoid numbness. Buyers hesitate, weighing choices carefully, knowing there may not be another opportunity soon. Haggling still happens, but with less enthusiasm. Energy is conserved. One detail that surprises many modern readers is how markets adapted physically to winter conditions. Temporary shelters appear. Canvas, rough wood, even overturned carts become windbreaks. Fires burn nearby, not to cook, but to keep fingers functional. Smoke hangs low, blending with breath clouds, creating a haze that blurs faces at a distance. Travel to and from markets is itself a risk. Frozen roads are unpredictable. Rivers, sometimes used as routes when solid, can turn deadly if ice gives way. You hear stories exchanged quietly. Someone who did not return, a cart lost, a fall that ended badly. These are not told dramatically. They are offered as warnings. Scholars examining medieval trade networks still disagree on how much winter weather disrupted long-distance commerce. Some argue that severe cold brought movement almost to a halt. Others suggest that necessity drove people to take greater risks maintaining supply lines despite danger. From where you stand, the truth feels mixed. Goods still arrive, but every item seems to carry the weight of efforts behind it. You notice how people prioritize. Luxury items vanish first. Spices become rare. Decorative goods disappear. What remains is practical. Food, fuel, tools, cloth. The market strips itself down to essentials, mirroring the season itself. Children are less present here now. Parents leave them at home when possible. The cold is unforgiving, and markets are crowded spaces with little room to move freely. When children do appear, they cling close eyes wide, watching transactions with quiet curiosity. They learn early how survival looks. There is a tension in the air that has little to do with conflict. It is the tension of calculation. Every decision matters more in winter. Buying too much of one thing means lacking another later. Selling too quickly might bring regret. The market becomes a place where future hardship is negotiated in small increments. You make your own choices carefully. A little grain, some dried legumes, perhaps a small piece of salted meat, if fortune allows. You feel the weight of these items immediately, not just physically, but mentally. Each one represents days of sustenance, moments of warmth, a margin of safety. As you prepare to leave, the sound of the market fades quickly behind you. There is no lingering chatter, no sense of event. It is simply another task completed, another calculation, resolved for now. On the walk home, you pass others carrying their own bundles, faces set, steps steady. There is a shared understanding here, unspoken but clear. Winter is not something you conquer. It is something you negotiate with day by day. Christmas is close enough now that some sellers mention it quietly. A nod, a brief comment about what might be set aside. Even here, amid scarcity, the feast shapes behaviour. Items are reserved, promises made. The market, stripped and subdued, still participates in anticipation. By the time you reach home, fingers aching, breath tight in your chest, the reality of winter trade settles fully. Markets have not failed you. They have simply adjusted, narrowing their offerings to what truly matters. And what truly matters, you're reminded, is not abundance, but continuity. The steady flow of just enough to carry you forward, one cold day at a time. You begin to understand that the Christmas meal ahead is not really about fullness. It is about contrast. After weeks of careful restraint, measured portions, and repetitive flavours, the idea of a feast takes on a meaning that goes far beyond nutrition. Even before a single dish is prepared, the feast already exists in people's minds, shaping behaviour and expectations. In the winter of 1198, a Christmas meal is less a break from hardship than a structured pause within it. Most accounts from the period suggest that people did not suddenly eat extravagantly, even on holy days. Supplies simply would not allow it. What changed was intention. Food was arranged to feel different. Ingredients were combined rather than separated. Familiar staples were presented in slightly altered forms. That shift alone carried emotional weight. You think about how often you have eaten simply to continue working. Bread eaten standing, soup consumed quickly before heading back into the cold. Christmas promises something else. Sitting, sharing, eating without urgency. That in itself feels radical. As preparations quietly advance, conversations turn speculative. What will there be this year? Will there be meat? Will there be something sweet? These questions are asked gently, sometimes indirectly, so as not to expose anxiety. Hope is handled carefully, not because people lack it, but because disappointment feels sharper in winter. The meaning of the feast is reinforced constantly by religious teaching. Christmas celebrates birthright and divine generosity entering a hard world. That message resonates more strongly when the world truly feels hard. You notice how sermons lean into this contrast, describing abundance not as excess but as grace arriving briefly, deliberately, and then passing again. There is an emotional economy at work here. The feast does not need to be large to be powerful. It needs to be different. A dish flavoured with fat instead of water. Bread baked fresh rather than reheated. A drink poured more freely. These details matter because they interrupt routine. One small but revealing practice from this period involves the saving of particular utensils or serving vessels for Christmas alone. A wooden bowl used only once a year. A cup brought out carefully wiped clean, then returned to storage afterward. Archaeological findings support the idea that households often reserved their best items for specific moments, even when those items were modest by any modern standard. The act of using them transformed the meal. There is still discussion among historians about how widespread such symbolic gestures were among poorer households. Some argue that survival needs left little room for ritual. Others point to consistent evidence of intentional celebration, even under strain. From within the moment, it feels clear that meaning does not require wealth. It requires recognition. You notice how people pace their preparations. Nothing is rushed. Fuel is too valuable to waste. Ingredients are added deliberately. Recipes are followed carefully, not because they are written down, but because they are remembered. This is not experimentation. It is preservation. Children sense the shift more keenly than adults expect. They notice when adults speak differently around food, when pots are guarded more closely, when certain items are moved out of sight and not touched. Anticipation becomes its own form of nourishment for them. The promise of Christmas fills spaces that hunger might otherwise occupy. The cold remains constant, pressing in through walls, settling into corners. But the feast holds its ground mentally. You find yourself thinking about it during tasks, imagining smells and textures. The thought warms you slightly, not physically, but emotionally. That warmth matters. An easily overlooked element of the Christmas meal is timing. Eating later in the day allows the body to warm first, to gather everyone together, to make the moment feel complete. The feast often follows church services, linking physical nourishment with spiritual reassurance. Hunger is delayed just long enough to sharpen appreciation. There is also restraint even within celebration. Leftovers matter. Bones are saved. Fat is rendered. Nothing is wasted. The feast is generous within limits, not careless. This balance reflects the broader mindset of the season. Joy is allowed, but it is not permitted to threaten survival. Some period narratives hint that laughter around the Christmas table carried a particular intensity during harsh winters. Humour, even mild, felt like defiance. Jokes landed harder. Smiles lingered longer. For a few hours, the cold lost some of its authority. Modern scholars examining medieval festive culture often note how deeply psychological these moments were. The feast functioned as reassurance that life still followed patterns. That time still moved forward. That hardship had not erased structure. In winters like that of 1198, such reassurance was not abstract, it was necessary. As Christmas draws nearer, you feel the weight of expectation settle more comfortably. The feast is no longer just a thought, it is a plan. Ingredients counted, tasks assigned, roles understood. The cold may dictate many things, but it does not dictate meaning. When you imagine the table now, you do not imagine excess. You imagine people leaning in, bowls passed carefully, steam rising slowly, conversation unhurried. The feast is a moment of alignment, when effort, faith, and endurance briefly meet. And in that meeting, you sense why Christmas mattered so deeply in winters like this. Not because it erased hardship, but because it acknowledged it and then offered something gentler in response. When you finally begin to picture the Christmas table itself, it looks nothing like the overflowing spreads you might imagine from later centuries. What sits there in 1198 is modest, deliberate, and shaped by geography, climate, and circumstance. Yet within those limits, the table tells a detailed story about who you are, where you live, and how this winter has treated you. In many regions of Europe, bread remains the foundation of the meal. Not soft white loaves, but dense dark bread made from rye barley, or a mixture of grains. Wheat exists, but it is not guaranteed. Loaves are cut carefully, each slice, thick enough to satisfy, thin enough to last. Bread serves as food utensil and symbol all at once. It fills the stomach, supports other dishes, and reminds everyone at the table of the harvest that preceded this winter. Alongside it, you're likely to find a pottage or stew. This is not a single recipe, but a category endlessly adaptable. Beans, peas, lentils, root vegetables, and whatever scraps of meat or fat can be spared are combined into something warm and sustaining. What makes the Christmas version distinct is not extravagance, but care. Ingredients are chosen rather than simply used up. The pot is watched closely. Flavour matters more tonight. Surviving household records and estate accounts suggest that meat appeared on Christmas tables more often than during Advent, even in lean years. Pork was common, especially salted or smoked cuts prepared months earlier. In coastal or river regions, fish might take precedence. Eels, herring, or dried cod appear depending on access and tradition. Fresh meat was rare in winter, but not unheard of, especially if an animal had been slaughtered earlier to avoid the cost of feeding it through the cold months. One detail that often escapes attention is how much of the meal relied on preservation skills perfected long before winter arrived. Salting, smoking, and drying were not merely techniques, they were acts of planning. The Christmas feast is in many ways the final reveal of decisions made in late summer and autumn. Each preserved item carries the memory of warmer days when the work was done. Vegetables remain humble. Turnips, parsnips, onions, leeks, cabbage if it survived storage. These are softened, sweetened slightly by slow cooking, transformed just enough to feel special. Herbs appear sparingly. Dried thyme or sage. Perhaps a pinch of something more fragrant if the household is fortunate. Even small changes in seasoning are noticed immediately. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how often sweets appeared on tables outside noble households. Sugar was expensive and rare. Honey, however, was more accessible, and it finds its way into Christmas in subtle forms. A drizzle added to bread, dried fruits soaked and warmed. These touches are not desserts in the modern sense, but they signal celebration through contrast. Drink matters as much as food. Ale is common brewed earlier in the year and consumed steadily through winter. On Christmas, it may be poured more generously. Wine appears in some regions, often diluted, its presence, tied closely to trade routes and wealth. Warmed drinks, sometimes infused with spices, offer comfort beyond their caloric value. They warm hands as much as throats. You notice how the table itself is arranged. There is intention here. Food is brought out together rather than piecemeal. Dishes are shared rather than individualized. The act of passing bowls creates connection. Hands reach. Eye contact happens. Conversation flows more easily when everyone participates in the same movement. A lesser-known custom in some areas involved placing an extra piece of bread on the table, not for eating, but as a symbolic offering. It might represent hospitality, remembrance, or a blessing for the household. Practices varied widely, and not everyone observed them, but the idea reflects a broader tendency to layer meaning onto the meal. Modern researchers sometimes disagree on how consistent Christmas menus were across regions. Climate, culture, and class introduced enormous variation. Yet there is a shared pattern that emerges. Christmas food emphasized warmth, shared effort, and the careful release of saved resources. It was never about waste, it was about acknowledgement. Children experience the table differently. They watch closely, aware that rules have shifted. Portions may be slightly larger. Foods normally withheld appear. This moment leaves an imprint. Memory attaches itself to taste and smell. Long after the winter passes, these sensations will resurface, tied to safety and belonging. You eat more slowly than usual. Not because the food is scarce tonight, but because it deserves attention. Each bite feels earned. Steam rises gently from bowls. The room smells richer than it has in weeks. Smoke from the hearth mingles with food, creating an atmosphere that feels almost protective. The cold does not vanish. It presses against walls, creeps along floors. But it is held at bay for now, by bodies gathered close by shared heat, by the rhythm of eating and talking. The table becomes a small island of order in a season that has offered little of it. Some observers from later centuries would romanticize meals like this, imagining simplicity as purity. Living through it, you understand something more grounded. The Christmas table of 1198 is neither ideal nor miserable. It is practical joy, carefully measured relief. When the meal draws to an end, there is no rush to clear it away. Dishes linger, conversation stretches, the warmth is allowed to last as long as possible. Outside, winter waits patiently. Inside, for a little while, you remain full. As the evening deepens on Christmas Day, attention shifts naturally from what was eaten to what is poured. Drink has been present all along, of course, sustaining you through the weeks of cold, but tonight it takes on a slightly different role. It is no longer just fuel. It becomes pacing warmth and permission to linger. Ale is the constant. In 1198, it is safer than much of the water, more reliable and deeply familiar. Brewed earlier in the year, it has aged quietly through autumn and into winter. By Christmas, it tastes fuller, rounder, less sharp than it did when first made. You notice how it sits in the stomach, heavy, but comforting, spreading warmth slowly, rather than all at once. Most households brew their own, and quality varies widely. Some ale is thin, barely more than flavoured liquid. Some is thick enough to feel like a meal on its own. Tonight, even the thinner versions are welcomed. Cups are refilled without the usual hesitation. Not recklessly, but generously. Wine appears less often, but when it does, it carries meaning. In regions connected to trade routes, wine is a reminder of places beyond this frozen landscape. Vineyards that still exist somewhere under a different sky. Barrels that travelled long distances despite risk and cost. Wine is often diluted, not to cheat anyone, but to make it last and soften its strength. Even so, it feels different in the mouth. Sharper, brighter, almost foreign. One detail that tends to surprise modern listeners is how often drinks were warmed in winter. Ale or wine might be heated gently, near the fire sometimes, with spices or herbs added, if available. not for indulgence but for comfort. Warm liquid works faster against the cold. You feel it immediately in your hands, then your chest, then your limbs. Spices themselves are rare, especially among poorer households. When they appear, they are used sparingly and deliberately. A pinch of something fragrant can transform an ordinary drink into a marker of occasion. The smell alone announces that this night is not like the others. There is disagreement among historians about how common spiced drinks were outside noble settings. Some argue they were largely symbolic, limited to wealthier tables. Others point to scattered references suggesting occasional use even among modest households. What feels certain is that when spices appeared, they were remembered. Drink also changes the sound of the room. Conversation loosens. Pauses grow longer but less awkward. Laughter emerges more easily, though it remains subdued, shaped by fatigue and habit. This is not revelry. It is release. You notice how people pace themselves. There is no hurry. Cups are lifted, set down, lifted again. Sips are taken rather than gulps. Everyone understands the cold is still waiting outside, and stumbling into it would be foolish. Celebration does not cancel caution. Children are given watered-down versions, or simply allowed to taste foam or sweetness. Their excitement comes less from intoxication and more from inclusion. Being allowed a sip marks them as part of the moment. Their faces brighten, cheeks flushed not just from heat, but from recognition. Alcohol serves another purpose tonight. It extends the evening. With more light from the hearth and more warmth in the body, sleep is delayed. Stories are told, familiar ones and half-remembered ones. Tales grow slightly exaggerated, edges softened or sharpened depending on the teller. Memory and imagination blur gently. There is a subtle social function at work. Drinking together affirms bonds. It smooths over tensions built during long weeks of strain. Disagreements are not resolved exactly, but they are suspended. Christmas creates a truce, and shared drink helps maintain it. Some medieval moralists warned against excess even on holy days, and those warnings still echo faintly. You are aware of them. You have heard them. But moderation tonight feels intuitive rather than imposed. The body, tired from cold and hunger, sets its own limits. A lesser-mentioned habit involves saving the final cup. Some households deliberately leave a small amount uneaten or undrunk, a gesture meant to acknowledge restraint, even in celebration. Practices vary and meanings shift from place to place, but the impulse reflects a broader mindset. Enjoyment does not erase awareness. As the night progresses, the room grows quieter rather than louder. Voices lower, movements slow. The fire settles into a steady glow. Outside, the cold presses just as hard as before, but it feels further away now, held back by warmth and shared presence. Drink has done its work, not by intoxicating, but by softening. It has filled the gaps left by hunger, loosened the tightness of long weeks, and allowed Christmas to feel distinct without becoming dangerous. Eventually, cups are set aside. People stretch, yawn, adjust layers. Sleep begins to cool gently but firmly. The warmth will not last forever. Fires will burn down. The night will reclaim its authority. But for now, you sit in that narrowing space between celebration and rest body, warmed from within mind, quieter than it has been in weeks. The drink has not changed the world outside. It has changed how you meet it. And in a winter like this, that change is enough. By the time Christmas evening settles fully into night, you realize how much effort it took simply to prepare the food you have already eaten. Cooking in a winter like this is not a background task. It is a negotiation with cold fuel time and fatigue. Every warm dish carries the imprint of struggle long before it reaches the table. You think back to the hearth earlier in the day. The fire was never allowed to blaze freely. Fuel was too precious for that. Instead, it was coaxed, fed, carefully kept alive, rather than allowed to flourish. Wood snapped and hissed as it warmed, releasing smells of sap and smoke. Someone tended it, constantly adjusting pieces, shielding flames from drafts, reading the fire like a living thing. In 1198, most cooking happens in or near a single hearth. There are no separate kitchens in ordinary homes, no controlled temperatures, no insulation to speak of. Heat radiates unevenly. One side of a pot boils while the other barely simmers. You learn quickly how to rotate vessels, how to judge readiness by sound and smell, rather than sight alone. It is generally understood by historians that fuel scarcity shaped medieval cooking more than recipe tradition ever did. Meals were planned around what could be cooked efficiently, not what sounded appealing. Long, simmering stews made sense because they used low, steady heat. Baking required careful timing to avoid wasting precious warmth. Every choice reflected an awareness of limits. You remember how hands stiffened while chopping, how fingers numbed quickly when touching metal or stone. Tasks that would be simple in warmer months now demanded pauses. Warming hands over the fire, flexing joints, waiting for sensation to return. Cooking stretched across hours, not because of complexity, but because bodies could only move so fast in the cold. Smoke was constant. Without proper chimneys, much of it lingered indoors, stinging eyes and throats. Yet it was tolerated, even welcomed, because it meant the fire was doing its work. Clothes absorbed the smell. Hair held it. The scent followed you long after the meal, a reminder of effort rather than inconvenience. One small detail that often goes unnoticed is how cookware itself influenced what could be made. Pots were heavy, thick-walled, slow to heat and slow to cool. Once warm, they retained heat well, but bringing them to that point required patience. Thin pans were rare and fragile. What you cooked had to suit the tools you owned. There is some uncertainty among modern scholars about how often households attempted complex dishes during extreme winters. Some suggest people simplified meals to conserve energy. Others point to evidence of deliberate effort during festivals, even when conditions were harsh. From within the moment, it feels less like contradiction and more like prioritization. Christmas justifies effort that other days do not. You recall the careful choreography of the day, tasks assigned early, ingredients prepared gradually, nothing left until the last minute. There is no room for improvisation when cold slows everything. Mistakes cost time, fuel, and sometimes food itself. Children are kept at a distance during cooking, not only for safety, but practicality. Space near the hearth is limited. Too many bodies disrupt airflow, cool the fire, complicate a movement. Still, they watch closely, absorbing patterns they will one day repeat. Cooking knowledge passes through observation more than instruction. Fat plays a quiet but central role. Drippings saved carefully. Bits of rendered fat added at the right moment to enrich flavor and calories. Fat burns hot, whether eaten or used as fuel. Its presence signals planning and foresight. As evening approaches, the work does not stop. Fires must be maintained, pots watched, dishes kept warm as long as possible. Serving itself becomes an act of timing. Too soon, and food cools quickly. Too late, and hunger sharpens again. There is a satisfaction that settles in once the hardest part is done. The fire steadies, the pots are moved aside, the room fills with smells that signal completion. Exhaustion mixes with relief. You feel it in your shoulders, your lower back, your hands. What strikes you most is how invisible this labor becomes once eating begins. The meal takes center stage. The effort recedes. This is not accidental. The success of the feast depends on allowing people to forget briefly how difficult it was to create. Later, when the room quiets and embers glow low, the traces reappear. Soot on walls, ash on the floor, utensils cooling slowly. These are the true record of Christmas cooking in a winter like this. Not abundance, but persistence. Cooking without spare heat teaches discipline. It rewards foresight. It punishes waste. It demands attention. And when it succeeds, it offers something rare in winter. A sense of control, however, limited over an environment that usually dictates terms. As you settle closer to the fire, body tired but steady, you understand that the feast was not just eaten. It was earned minute by minute, flame by flame. And tomorrow the cold will still be there, waiting patiently for the fire to be lit again. As night deepens, sound becomes more noticeable than sight. The fire dims to a steady glow, shadows soften, and the world beyond the walls asserts itself through noise rather than shape. You sit quietly and listen, realizing that Christmas night has its own acoustics sharpened by cold and stillness. Outside, the wind moves through bare branches with a dry, brittle whisper. It is not the dramatic roar of a storm, but a constant threading sound, as if the landscape itself is breathing slowly. Snow, when it shifts, does so reluctantly, releasing a faint hiss as crust breaks under pressure. The cold carries these sounds farther than you expect. Distance collapses in winter. Inside, the room has its own language. Wood pops softly as beams adjust to heat. Embers settle with a faint sigh. Someone shifts on a bench, the scrape of wood against stone, sounding louder than it would by day. Voices, when they appear, are low and measured instinctively, shaped to fit the hour. Church bells mark the night, at intervals, their tones heavy and deliberate. They do not rush. Each strike seems to pause in the air, before fading as if reluctant to let go. Bells in winter serve more than a practical purpose. They orient you, reminding you that time continues to move, even when everything else feels suspended. Animals contribute their own layer of sound. A cow exhales slowly from the byre. A dog shifts its weight nails, clicking briefly on stone. Livestock sleep closer to human spaces now, not out of sentiment, but practicality. Their presence changes the soundscape, anchoring it with steady living noise. Period descriptions often note how quiet winter nights felt compared to other seasons. Insects are gone, birds are scarce, human activity contracts inward. This absence amplifies what remains. You hear things you would normally miss, your own breathing, the rustle of clothing, the small involuntary noises of tired bodies settling. There is still debate among historians about how much communal noise marked Christmas nights in ordinary villages. Some sources emphasize singing and shared prayer. Others suggest a quieter observance, shaped by exhaustion and cold. Listening now, it feels as though both are true depending on the moment. Sound rises briefly, then recedes, never fully claiming the night. At certain points, song emerges, not loudly, not polished. Familiar melodies hummed rather than performed. The kind of singing that does not demand attention, but offers companionship. Voices blend unevenly, some dropping out, others carrying on. The effect is soothing rather than celebratory. Children struggle to stay awake. You hear it in their breathing, uneven and shallow. Occasionally, one startles awake, momentarily disoriented, then settles again. Sleep comes earlier, on nights like this, pulled forward by cold and full stomachs. A small but intriguing habit mentioned in a handful of sources involves people listening deliberately on Christmas night for signs from the natural world. Wind direction, cracking ice, the call of an animal. These sounds were sometimes interpreted as omens for the coming year. Whether widely believed or quietly indulged, the practice reflects how closely people attended to their environment. The cold sharpens not only sound but silence. Pauses between noises feel longer. When everything stills at once, the quiet presses in, dense and noticeable. It is not empty. It feels occupied by waiting. You notice how conversation fades without formal ending. Words slow, sentences trail off. People lean back, eyes closing briefly, then opening again. The room settles into a shared rhythm of near sleep, held together by warmth and habit. Firelight flickers gently, casting slow-moving shapes along walls. The visual softness pairs with the auditory calm, creating a space that feels insulated from the harshness beyond it. The cold has not disappeared, but its voice is muffled here. At some point, bells ring again, distant but clear. Midnight passes almost unnoticed. Christmas has arrived fully, then begun to move on. There is no dramatic shift, just a quiet acknowledgement absorbed into the night. As you prepare to sleep, sounds recede one by one. The fire quiets, breathing evens out. Outside, the wind continues its steady movement, unconcerned with calendars or feasts. You lie there, wrapped tightly, listening until listening becomes unnecessary. The sounds of Christmas night blend into something familiar, something safe enough to allow rest. And sleep long delayed by cold and effort finally arrives, carrying you gently through the darkest hours of winter. Morning arrives slowly announced, less by light than by movement. You wake to the subtle shifting of bodies around you, the careful repositioning of limbs, stiff from sleep and cold. Christmas Day has passed, but its echo remains, in the room lingering in the air, like warmth that has not yet fully faded. Gift-giving in 1198 is not an event set apart with ceremony. It is woven into the day quietly, almost modestly, as if drawing too much attention to it might feel indulgent. You do not gather around a tree. There are no piles to unwrap. Instead, gifts appear gradually handed over, with little announcement, often accompanied by practical words rather than celebration. Most people expect nothing large. That expectation shapes the experience itself. A gift is not judged by novelty or size, but by usefulness and intention. A pair of woolen mitts, a small knife, a length of cloth, something made rather than bought. These items carry the mark of time spent, of effort invested earlier in the year. Records from this period indicate that gift-giving during Christmas was far more symbolic than transactional. It reinforced bonds rather than displayed wealth. You see this in the way gifts are exchanged between people who share daily labour. A neighbour who helped with harvest. A relative who watched children during illness. The gift acknowledges connection rather than obligation. Children receive the simplest tokens: a carved wooden figure, a polished stone, a piece of fruit saved carefully from autumn. Their delight comes not from comparison, but from recognition. Someone thought of them. Someone set something aside. That awareness lingers long after the object itself is worn or lost. You notice that gifts are often accompanied by words of blessing or quiet hope. Wishes for health, for easier days ahead, for survival through the rest of winter. These phrases are not poetic, they are direct. They reflect the concerns that fill people's thoughts when resources are limited and uncertainty is constant. There is an interesting detail that surfaces in some household accounts from this era. Gifts were sometimes shared communally rather than owned individually. A new tool added to the household, a pot that everyone would use. In these cases, the act of giving strengthened the group rather than elevating one person. Ownership mattered less than access. Modern historians continue to examine how widespread gift-giving truly was among poorer communities. Some suggest it was limited, even rare. Others argue that while material gifts were small, symbolic exchanges were common. Living within the moment, the distinction feels less important. What matters is the acknowledgement, the pause in routine that says, this day is different. Gift exchanges tend to happen indoors, close to the hearth, where fingers can move more easily. Cold limits dexterity. Wrapping is minimal or non-existent. Cloth or simple bindings suffice. The lack of spectacle places focus on faces rather than objects. Reactions are watched closely. Gratitude is expressed plainly. You sense a careful balance at work. No one wants to burden another with expectation. Giving too much might imply excess. Giving nothing might feel like neglect. The middle ground is navigated through shared understanding rather than explicit rules. Adults receive gifts with a mix of appreciation and restraint. Praise is offered but not exaggerated. There is an awareness that resources remain scarce. Any item received means another item was not kept. This knowledge tempers response, grounding joy in realism. Children, by contrast, react more freely. Their excitement briefly lifts the room. Laughter breaks out. Energy spikes. Then it settles again, softened by fatigue and warmth. Their joy feels contagious, even if short-lived. A small but telling custom appears in some regions where gifts were placed secretly rather than handed directly. Left on a bench, tucked near a bed, discovered later. This added an element of surprise without requiring display. It also allowed givers to avoid attention, keeping the act itself modest. As the morning progresses, gift-giving gives way to routine once more. Items are put away, tools are tested, food is shared again, though more simply now. The day continues, but it does so with a slight change in tone. Something has been acknowledged, bonds reinforced. What strikes you most is how little ownership dominates the moment. Gifts are valued for what they allow you to do rather than what they represent. Warmth, utility, continuity. These are the currencies that matter in a winter like this. In later centuries, Christmas gift-giving will grow louder, more elaborate, more commercial. Here in 1198, it remains quiet and grounded. It fits the season. It respects the cold rather than pretending it is not there. As the day moves on, the memory of the exchange lingers, not because of objects, but because of the brief pause it created. A reminder that even in scarcity, people found ways to mark care. You hold on to that feeling as you return to daily tasks. The winter is far from over, but for a moment it feels slightly less heavy. Children experience this winter differently than adults, though the difference is not immediately obvious. You notice it in the way they move quick and restless, even in heavy layers, as if their bodies have not yet learned to conserve energy the way grown ones have. Christmas has passed, gifts have been quietly exchanged, and now the long stretch of winter opens again before them. They wake early, often before the light, driven less by responsibility and more by habit. Sleep comes easily, but does not always last. The cold nudges them awake, and hunger follows close behind. You watch them hover near the hearth, drawn instinctively to warmth, hands, extended fingers, flexing slowly as sensation returns. For children in 1198, winter is not framed as hardship in the abstract. It is immediate. It is cold floors. It is gloves that do not quite fit. It is being told to stay inside when the body wants to move. Yet there is also familiarity here. They have lived through winters before, even if they cannot measure them against one another yet. Most evidence from medieval household life suggests that children were expected to contribute even during harsh seasons. Small tasks, carrying kindling, watching younger siblings, turning spit handles when cooking. These duties are scaled to size, but they matter. Participation offers structure, and structure helps days pass. You notice how play adapts. Outdoor games shrink in duration, bursts of activity, followed by retreats indoors. Snow becomes material rather than obstacle, packed into balls, shaped into rough figures, tracked with footprints that crisscross yards, until adults call them back inside. Laughter cuts sharply through the cold, then fades as quickly as it appeared. Indoors, imagination expands to fill space. Stories are retold endlessly, each version drifting slightly from the last. Simple objects become props. A stick becomes a sword. A scrap of cloth becomes a cloak. These inventions require little energy, but offer escape, and children move between them fluidly. There remains uncertainty among modern researchers about how children understood religious meaning at this age. Some suggest they absorbed doctrine through repetition more than comprehension. Others argue that ritual and story shaped emotional understanding long before intellectual grasp. Watching them now, you see both. They know Christmas mattered. They feel its importance. The reasons remain fuzzy, but the sensation lingers. Food affects children more visibly. Their moods shift quickly with hunger or warmth. A small treat left over from Christmas can brighten an entire day. A lack of it can sour hours. Adults respond by redirecting attention, assigning tasks, offering reassurance rather than explanation. Survival requires steadiness. A lesser-mentioned aspect of winter childhood involves sleep. Children often sleep more in winter, drawn into longer rest by darkness and limited activity. Yet they also wake more frequently, disturbed by cold or noise. Nighttime becomes fragmented, shared, communal. You hear them stir, murmur, settle again. Clothing is layered, adjusted constantly. Sleeves pushed back, then pulled down. Hoods tightened then loosened. Nothing fits perfectly. For long as children grow, even in winter, garments are passed down, altered, patched. Wearing clothes that once belonged to someone else is normal, unremarkable. You see how children learn winter knowledge without instruction. They know where drafts form, which corners stay warm, how close they can get to the fire safely. They observe adults closely mimicking movements, absorbing habits that will surface later without conscious recall. One small, easily overlooked behavior appears during long winters. Children listen more than they speak. Stories told by adults sink in deeply. Tales of past winters, of animals, of saints, of mistakes made and survived. These narratives fill the quiet hours and shape understanding of the world. Despite cold and constraint, there are moments of pure ease. A child asleep against a parent's side, a shared laugh over something trivial, a song half remembered sung softly and imperfectly. These moments do not erase winter, but they soften its edges. As days stretch on after Christmas, children sense the shift back to routine, but without disappointment. Celebration was brief. That was expected. The return to ordinary life feels natural rather than abrupt. You watch them move through this season with a resilience that is less conscious than yours. They do not frame winter as something to be endured. It simply is. They adapt without naming it, accepting cold and warmth as parts of the same cycle. And in that quiet acceptance, you see something instructive. Children survive winter not by understanding it, but by inhabiting it fully, one small moment at a time. As the days following Christmas settle back into routine, differences between households become more visible. The cold does not treat everyone equally. It presses harder on some doors than others, and you feel that imbalance as you move through familiar spaces with new awareness. In wealthier homes, walls are thicker, built from stone that holds heat just a little longer. Rooms are fewer, but more enclosed. Fires burn more consistently, not brighter, but steadier. Fuel stores are deeper, stacked carefully in sheds or cellars protected from damp. These advantages do not erase winter, but they soften it. In poorer dwellings, space is shared more tightly. Drafts find their way through gaps in wood and thatch. Fires are lit later in the day and allowed to die sooner. Fuel is counted piece by piece. You notice how people position themselves instinctively to block wind, how furniture is rearranged to create barriers, how bodies become part of the structure that holds warmth in. Accounts from the period make clear that class shaped winter experience as much as geography. Access to land animals and storage determine how long comfort could be maintained. This is not a matter of luxury versus misery. It is a matter of margin. Some households have room for error, others do not. Nobles and clergy often celebrate Christmas with more ceremony, more food, more light. Halls are larger, fires more numerous. Music carries farther. Yet even here, winter asserts itself. Stone halls are difficult to heat. Warmth pulls near fires but fades quickly with distance. Servants move constantly, carrying food and drink, their labour essential to sustaining the illusion of ease. You notice that abundance creates its own form of effort. Larger households require more coordination, more fuel, more preparation. Waste is discouraged even among the privileged because winter makes extravagance risky. The idea that medieval elites lived without concern for scarcity does not hold up under close inspection. There is still debate among modern historians about how much Christmas softened class boundaries, even temporarily. Some suggest shared religious observance created moments of equality. Others argue that hierarchy remained firmly intact, reinforced by seating, serving, order, and access. Watching the dynamics unfold, you sense that both interpretations hold truth. Boundaries blur slightly, but they do not disappear. Among peasants and labourers, celebration is quieter but no less meaningful. Tables are smaller. Portions are modest. Yet the sense of occasion feels just as strong, perhaps stronger, because resources were stretched to create it. The effort itself becomes part of the gift. You observe how clothing marks status even in winter. Better cloaks fall more heavily lined with fur or thicker wool. Boots fit more securely, keeping feet drier. These details matter deeply in cold conditions. Comfort accumulates through small advantages. A subtle but telling practice appears in how people sit. Those with more warmth available tend to spread out. Those without cluster closer together. Space itself becomes a measure of security. You feel it when entering different homes, the way bodies arrange themselves unconsciously. Children notice these differences early. They compare without articulating. They feel it in how long they are allowed to stay near the fire, in how many layers they wear, in how often they are sent outdoors. These impressions settle quietly, shaping understanding of the world. Charity plays a role during this season, though it is uneven. Almsgiving increases around Christmas, encouraged by sermons and tradition. Food, fuel and clothing are distributed sometimes formally, sometimes through personal ties. This assistance helps, but it does not equalize conditions. It offers relief rather than transformation. Some records from the late 12th century mention lords providing extra meals or fuel to tenants during extreme winters. Whether these gestures were widespread or strategic remains unclear. What is evident is that winter sharpened awareness of dependence. Everyone relied on someone else, whether they acknowledged it openly or not. You sense how dignity is preserved even in imbalance. People accept help without spectacle. Giving is done quietly when possible. Pride and necessity negotiate constantly, finding compromises that allow survival without humiliation. The church functions as a space where class distinctions soften slightly. Bodies stand together. Breath mingles, cold equalizes sensation, if not circumstance. Yet even here positions are marked. Some kneel closer to the altar, others remain near the back. Hierarchy adapts rather than vanishes. As winter continues, the contrast between households becomes a source of quiet tension. Envy appears briefly, then recedes. Everyone knows that fortune shifts. A good year can follow a bad one. A harsh winter can undo advantage quickly. Awareness tempers judgment. What strikes you most is how resilience manifests differently across classes. Wealth provides insulation. Poverty fosters adaptability. Both require effort. Both carry cost. Neither guarantees ease. When night falls, these differences compress again. Darkness and cold reduce everything to essentials. Fires glow, bodies gather. The outside world fades. In these hours, class matters less than warmth. You return home carrying this awareness with you. The winter remains long. Resources remain limited, yet understanding grows sharper. Survival is not shared equally, but it is shared enough to bind communities together. In the cold of 1198, inequality is not an abstract concept. It is felt in fingers, in breath, in how close you sit to the fire. And Christmas brief, as it was only made those contrasts clearer by offering a moment to see them. As the days slip further into winter, you sense a change in how people talk about the cold. It is no longer just weather. It becomes a presence that invites interpretation. In a world where explanations are woven from faith, memory, and observation, winter encourages meaning to gather around it. You hear it in passing remarks. Someone notes the way frost clings to a doorway longer than usual. Another mentions how the wind shifted direction during the night. These are not idle comments. They carry weight quietly assessed and stored away. Patterns are searched for even when none are obvious. In 1198, superstition is not a separate category from belief. It lives alongside prayer and routine, filling gaps where certainty fails. People look for reassurance in signs, especially during extreme conditions. The harsher the winter, the stronger the urge to explain it. You notice small rituals emerge or resurface. A bit of bread left near the hearth overnight. A whispered phrase spoken before bed. These actions are not formalized. They vary from household to household, passed down through habit rather than instruction. They offer a sense of agency, however slight, in a season that strips control away. Folklore surrounding winter often focuses on thresholds. Doorways, windows, the edge of the hearth. These are places where warmth meets cold, safety meets risk. You see people touch wood before stepping outside, pause briefly at entrances, glance upward, before opening shutters. These gestures are subtle, almost unconscious. Animals are watched closely. Their behaviour is read as commentary on the coming days. A dog that refuses to leave the fire. Livestock that grow restless at night. Birds appearing where they usually do not. These observations are shared cautiously, neither fully believed nor dismissed. There is a long-standing tradition of associating Christmas and its surrounding days with omens for the year ahead. The weather on these days is noted carefully. Clear skies are welcomed. Sudden storms raise concern. While interpretations differ, the act of watching itself creates a sense of participation in time's unfolding. Some modern historians suggest that such beliefs offered psychological comfort rather than predictive power. Others argue they structured communal response to uncertainty. From within the moment, the distinction feels unimportant. What matters is that attention is directed outward towards something larger than individual discomfort. Children absorb these ideas quickly. They listen to stories told by the fire eyes, wide filing away images of spirits, saints, and unseen forces. Fear and fascination mix easily at this age. Adults temper tales, carefully avoiding outright terror while still acknowledging mystery. You feel how superstition operates gently here. It does not override daily life. It runs parallel to it, offering explanation without demanding action. No one stops feeding animals or lighting fires because of a sign. Instead, signs add texture to experience, turning endurance into narrative. A lesser-mentioned practice involves marking days after Christmas as especially sensitive. Certain tasks are avoided, certain words left unsaid. Whether these customs were widespread or localized remains unclear, but they reflect a broader impulse to treat the turning of the year with care. The Church addresses these beliefs indirectly. Sermons emphasize faith over fear, order over chaos. Yet clergy themselves are not immune to cultural habits. They live in the same cold, hear the same stories, watch the same skies. Official doctrine and lived belief coexist sometimes uneasily. You notice how superstition recedes slightly during moments of shared warmth. Around the fire, during meals, in conversation. Fear finds less space when bodies are comfortable. It grows strongest in isolation, during long nights and quiet hours. Winter sharpens imagination. Shadows stretch, sounds linger, silence feels charged. In this environment, it is natural to sense more than what is visible. Superstition thrives not because people are foolish, but because conditions invite it. As you prepare for another night, you catch yourself listening more carefully than necessary. The wind, the house settling, a distant sound that could be something or nothing. You smile slightly at the habit, recognizing it without judging it. These beliefs do not promise safety, they promise meaning. They frame hardship within stories that can be told and retold, shared and adjusted. In a season that tests endurance, meaning becomes a form of warmth. You lie down, knowing that the cold will return with morning, just as it has every day. Yet wrapped within layers of belief and habit, the winter feels less empty. It feels observed, interpreted, held within human attention. And that attention, quiet and persistent, is another way people in 1198 endure the snow. As winter presses on beyond Christmas, the village carries a quieter weight. Celebration has passed, superstition has softened into routine again, and now the cold reveals its most difficult companion illness. You feel it in the way people move. More cautiously, speak more softly, and watch one another with heightened attention. Cold weakens bodies. That is something people in 1198 understand through experience, rather than theory. Chests tighten. Coughs linger. Small wounds heal slowly. A fever that might pass in summer becomes dangerous when warmth is scarce and nourishment thin. You notice how often hands are placed on foreheads, how frequently breath is measured by sound alone. Most medieval communities lived with illness as a constant presence, but winter amplifies its reach. Fires help, but smoke irritates lungs, already strained by cold air. Crowded sleeping arrangements conserve heat, but allow sickness to spread easily. What keeps people alive also places them at risk. Records from this period repeatedly mention winter mortality rising during prolonged cold spells, not always dramatically, but steadily. Death does not arrive as catastrophe. It arrives as accumulation. A child who does not recover, an elder whose strength fades quietly. Someone who slips falls and never truly rises again. You feel the village adjust, work slows, tasks are redistributed, people check on one another more often, sometimes under the pretense of borrowing or returning something small. These visits are brief but meaningful. Absence is noted quickly. Silence carries information. There is no clear agreement among modern researchers about how communities understood disease itself. Some emphasize religious interpretation, others highlight practical observation and herbal knowledge. Living here, you see both at work. Prayer is offered, remedies are tried, warmth is prioritized wherever possible. Herbs saved from summer appear now steeped into drinks or pressed into poultices. Their effects vary. Sometimes they help, sometimes they simply offer comfort. Either way, effort matters. Doing something feels better than doing nothing. Death, when it comes, is handled with restraint. There is grief but also urgency. The ground is frozen. Burial is difficult. Rituals adapt. Bodies are kept in cold spaces until digging becomes possible. This delay changes the rhythm of mourning, stretching it out quiet rather than intense. Children sense loss even when it is not explained to them. They notice missing faces, empty places near the fire. Adults lower their voices around them, but the absence speaks clearly enough. Winter teaches awareness early. One overlooked detail from harsh winters involves the role of communal memory. People remember previous losses. Names surface in conversation. Comparisons are made. This winter is measured against others, not in numbers, but in feeling. The act of remembering situates current suffering within a longer story. You also see endurance take form. People recover, fevers break, strength returns slowly. Survival is celebrated quietly, without announcement. Someone who returns to work after illness is welcomed back with nods, not fanfare. Continuity itself is victory. The church offers structure during these moments. Bells mark deaths as well as ours. Prayers are said, collectively, binding grief into ritual. Faith provides language when explanation fails. It does not erase fear, but it gives it shape. As night falls, households draw closer together. Fires are fed carefully. Sleep comes unevenly, interrupted by coughing or discomfort. You lie awake at times, listening, counting breaths, not your own. The cold sharpens concern, and yet life continues. Animals must be tended, food prepared, children guided. The presence of illness does not stop necessity. It layers on top of it, demanding patience and attention. Winter exposes fragility, but it also reveals capacity. People adapt not because they expect to, but because they must. Care becomes routine. Loss becomes acknowledged without spectacle. Endurance settles into daily practice. When you finally rest, you do so knowing that survival in this season is not guaranteed, but neither is it random. It is shaped by proximity care, warmth and time. Small decisions accumulate. Small mercies matter. In the frozen months of 1198, illness and death walk close, but they do not walk alone. They are accompanied by vigilance, by shared effort, by a determination that persists quietly, one cold night at a time. Laughter feels different now, emerging cautiously after weeks of restraint and worry. It does not burst out. It seeps in, tentative at first, then steadier, finding space, even in the narrow margins winter allows. You notice it in small moments, rather than grand ones. It might begin with a comment made too dryly, a remark about the stubborn fire, a shared glance when something goes slightly wrong, and no one has the energy to correct it properly. Humour slips in sideways unannounced, and when it does, the room changes subtly. Shoulders lower, breathing eases, the cold loses a fraction of its authority. Evidence from medieval storytelling and song suggests that humour played a crucial role in sustaining morale during hard seasons. Jokes were simple, often repetitive, sometimes crude but rarely cruel. They relied on familiarity rather than surprise. The same tale retold with minor variations. The same punchline delivered with exaggerated seriousness. Laughter came not from novelty, but from recognition. You hear songs emerge again in the days after Christmas. Not formal carols, but work songs and playful verses adapted to the season. Lyrics shift to match circumstance. Names are swapped, local events woven in. These songs are not written down. They travel mouth to mouth, altered slightly each time alive in their imperfection. Children contribute freely here. Their humour is physical, unfiltered. Slips turned into jokes. Silly faces made when adults are not looking, or when they are and pretend not to notice. Their laughter rings sharper, higher, cutting cleanly through the heavier atmosphere. Adults respond carefully at first, then more openly. A smile given, a chuckle allowed. Full laughter remains rare, not because it is forbidden, but because energy is still limited. Even joy must be rationed. Yet when it arrives, it feels earned. There remains discussion among scholars about how much medieval humour functioned as resistance versus relief. Some argue it challenged authority subtly. Others suggest it primarily soothed rather than confronted. From where you sit, it feels less strategic and more instinctive. Humour happens because silence grows too heavy without it. One curious habit described in a few regional accounts involves playful exaggeration during winter storytelling. Cold is made colder, hunger hungrier, misfortune more absurd. By stretching hardship to the point of humour, its power is blunted. The story becomes manageable even when the reality remains unchanged. You notice how laughter tends to appear near the fire. Warmth encourages openness. Cold stiffens expression. This pattern repeats often enough to feel intentional, though no one comments on it. The body leads, the mind follows. Even teasing returns carefully. Gentle remarks exchanged between neighbours. Familiar complaints voiced with a smile. These interactions reaffirm connection. They remind everyone that relationships remain intact despite strain. There is also laughter of relief. Someone recovers from illness. A task goes more smoothly than expected. A small success feels larger than it would in easier times. Celebration need not be loud to be genuine. As evening settles, humour fades naturally into quiet conversation. Jokes do not linger long. They do not need to. Their purpose has been served. The room feels lighter not because problems are gone, but because attention has shifted, if only briefly. You reflect on how essential these moments are. Laughter does not warm the body directly, but it loosens it. It restores rhythm. It reminds people of themselves beyond endurance. In winters remembered for hardship, humour often survives in fragments. A line recorded, a song hinted at, a story preserved out of context. These fragments suggest that, even in the coldest seasons, people found room to smile. As you prepare for sleep, a faint echo of laughter remains soft and distant. It does not chase away the cold. It coexists with it, and that coexistence matters. In 1198, laughter is not a luxury. It is a tool, quiet, adaptable, and surprisingly resilient. A way of staying human when winter tests every other resource. The morning after Christmas arrives without ceremony. You wake to the same cold, the same dim light pressing through cracks and shutters, the same stiffness in your limbs. There is no gentle transition back to ordinary life. Winter does not acknowledge feast days once they have passed. It simply continues. December 26th feels heavier than the days before Christmas, not because conditions have worsened, but because expectation has lifted. The pause is over. The brief sense of exception has closed. What remains is the long stretch ahead, still uncertain, still demanding attention. You notice how quickly routines reassert themselves. Fires are built again with familiar care. Animals are fed. Tools are lifted. Leftovers are measured and redistributed. The household settles back into its established rhythm, but with a subtle difference. There is a memory now, fresh and sustaining. Many contemporary records indicate that the days following Christmas were often marked by practical accounting. Supplies were checked, remaining fuel counted, food stores reassessed with clearer eyes. Celebration had used resources deliberately, and now it was time to understand what had been spent. This was not regret, it was responsibility. You feel the cold more sharply today. The body seems slower to warm. Muscles protest longer. Perhaps it is fatigue. Perhaps it is contrast. Warmth feels rarer after being briefly enjoyed. You adjust, layering more carefully, moving more deliberately. Conversations change tone, less reflective, more immediate. Plans are made quietly. Who will travel where? Which tasks must be prioritized? Which repairs cannot wait? The winter calendar stretches forward, filled with small obligations rather than milestones. Children sense the shift too. Their excitement has softened into restlessness. They return to chores and games shaped by limitation. Snow no longer feels novel. It is simply there. They accept this without disappointment because they are accustomed to rhythm rather than event. A small but revealing detail appears in how people talk about the feast afterward. Not with longing, but with satisfaction. The meal was good. The night was warm. That is enough. There is no indulgent replaying of what was eaten. Memory serves reassurance rather than desire. There is some disagreement among modern scholars about whether post-Christmas days carried particular religious significance for ordinary people, or whether they blended quickly back into work. Living through it, the answer feels simple. Both. The calendar still matters, but survival claims priority. Holy days sit alongside practical necessity rather than above it. You step outside and notice that tracks in the snow have multiplied. Movement has resumed fully. Paths widen again. Evidence of life returns to the landscape, etched into its frozen surface. Winter is active, not dormant. The sky remains low. Light arrives reluctantly and leaves quickly. You measure the day not by hours but by tasks completed before darkness. Efficiency returns. Reflection recedes. One easily missed habit involves cleaning after Christmas. Utensils are scrubbed thoroughly. Special items are returned to storage. Spaces near the hearth are cleared. This act of resetting is quiet but meaningful. It signals readiness for what comes next. There is also relief in the return to routine. Uncertainty narrows. The extraordinary has passed. Ordinary endurance resumes, and there is comfort in its familiarity. You know how to do this. You have done it before. As evening falls again, the memory of Christmas feels already distant, though not gone. It lingers as warmth recalled rather than warmth felt. That distinction matters. Memory does not heat the room, but it steadies the mind. You sit by the fire, aware that embers from last night are now ash. Fires must always be rebuilt. Nothing sustains itself without effort. This lesson is constant in winter, reinforced daily. When sleep comes, it does so with less anticipation than the night before, but also less tension. You know what tomorrow will require. There is comfort in that knowledge. The morning after Christmas in 1198 is not a letdown. It is a return. A quiet acceptance that celebration and hardship are not opposites, but parts of the same cycle. And as the cold settles in once more, you carry forward not the feast itself, but what it confirmed. You can pause, you can gather, you can continue. As the year edges toward its end, you sense that people begin to carry Christmas with them in a quieter way. The feast is gone, the gifts put away, the songs mostly faded, yet the memory of that pause settles into daily thought. It becomes a reference point, a small anchor in a season that still feels long and uncertain. You hear it in conversation. Someone mentions how warm the room felt that night. Another recalls a particular dish, not in detail, but in feeling. These recollections surface casually, woven into talk about weather or work, and then drift away again. Christmas is no longer an event. It is a shared memory, gently reinforcing connection. Written accounts from the late 12th century often show that people remembered winters not by dates but by experiences. A hard frost, a good meal, a loss, a recovery. In that way, Christmas of 1198 becomes part of a larger story, one that will be told later as a marker of endurance rather than celebration alone. You notice how faith shifts after the holiday. Prayer remains, but its tone changes. Less anticipation, more reflection. People seem to consider what the season has shown them. Patience, fragility, the importance of preparation. These lessons are not articulated formally. They settle quietly, shaping behaviour without instruction. There is ongoing uncertainty among modern historians about how consciously people interpreted these moments. Some suggest deep reflection guided by religious teaching. Others see habit and tradition doing most of the work. Living here, the line feels blurred. Meaning arises not from analysis but from repetition and shared experience. The church continues to mark days, but attention begins to turn outward again, toward the fields resting under frost, toward the animals that must carry the household through winter, toward the slow lengthening of days that will eventually come, though it is not yet noticeable. You sense a careful optimism, not excitement, not hope in the modern sense, but readiness. People talk about spring without expectation, simply acknowledging that seasons turn because they always have. This trust in pattern provides steadiness when comfort is scarce. One small, easily missed behaviour becomes noticeable now. People reuse phrases from Christmas prayers in everyday speech, not formally, not as quotes, but as familiar words that feel reassuring. Language itself carries warmth forward, repurposed for ordinary days. Children absorb these shifts intuitively. They return to play shaped by routine, yet references to Christmas appear unexpectedly. A game reenacts the feast. A song fragment resurfaces. The holiday lingers in imagination, even as life moves on. Memory also brings perspective. Hardship before Christmas is reassessed. It becomes something survived rather than endured without end. This reframing matters. It gives the remaining winter a boundary, even if that boundary exists only in thought. Some medieval writers later reflected on winters like this one as tests of communal strength. Whether those reflections represent widespread feeling or individual interpretation remains open. What feels clear now is that shared memory binds people together. You endured the same cold. You ate the same meal. You listened to the same bells. As night falls again, you sit near the fire, quieter than you were weeks ago, not exhausted but settled. The season has taught you its rhythms. You know how to listen to the house, how to judge the fire, how to pace yourself. Christmas has receded into the past, but it has not vanished. It has changed shape, becoming part of the winter itself rather than standing apart from it. The feast does not glow as brightly in memory as it did in anticipation, but it feels steadier now. You realize that this is how meaning often works here. It arrives briefly, then disperses, leaving behind traces that guide behavior long after the moment has passed. No fanfare, no conclusion, just continuity. As the year draws closer to its turning point, you carry this awareness with you. The winter remains harsh. The cold still presses. Yet memory offers balance, reminding you that pauses are possible, that warmth can be created even briefly against overwhelming conditions. In the frozen season of 1198, faith and memory intertwine quietly. They do not promise ease, they promise perspective. And in a winter that asks for endurance above all else, perspective is a gift that lasts far longer than any feast. You do not notice the cold loosening its grip all at once. There is no clear moment when winter ends. Instead, change arrives so subtly that you doubt it at first. A morning when the frost feels thinner, an afternoon when light lingers just a fraction longer, a sound of water moving beneath ice rather than sitting silent and locked. In the months after Christmas of 1198, people will remember this winter as one that held on longer than expected. Not endlessly, not catastrophically, but persistently. The kind of winter that teaches patience by repetition rather than shock. The kind that shapes habits quietly, then releases them just as quietly. Over time, tasks become easier by degrees. Hands regain dexterity a little faster near the fire. Breath hurts less when you step outside. Animals stir earlier in the day. These are small shifts, but they are noticed. Attention sharpened by months of watching catches every sign. From surviving chronicles and seasonal records, it's clear that winters like this one influenced how communities planned for years to come. Storage habits changed. Preservation methods were refined. Certain practices were kept, not because they were comfortable, but because they worked. Hard seasons left instructions behind even when no one wrote them down. You sense this forward-looking adjustment already taking shape. People talk about what they will do differently next year. When to slaughter. How much to store. Which repairs must be finished before cold returns. These conversations do not feel hopeful or fearful. They feel practical, grounded in experience rather than expectation. There is still no complete agreement among modern researchers about how directly individual winters shaped long-term tradition. Some argue that change came slowly across generations. Others suggest that extreme seasons accelerated adaptation. From within the moment, it feels obvious that memory informs action. What hurt is not forgotten. One understated habit emerges as winter softens. People begin to spend slightly more time outside again, even before conditions fully improve. They test the air. They linger for a few breaths longer. This cautious re-entry marks the turning more clearly than any calendar. Children sense it first. They range farther, stay out longer, return with flushed faces rather than stiff ones. Their energy shifts. Adults notice and allow it, watching carefully, but with less urgency. The church bells sound different now, not because they have changed, but because the air carries them differently. Sound disperses more easily. Silence loses some of its density. The world feels marginally less enclosed. When people look back on Christmas of 1198 in later years, they will not remember it for abundance. They will remember it as a moment that held against the cold, a point of balance in a season that demanded endurance. Its significance lies not in what was eaten or given, but in what was proven. You understand now that this is how tradition survives, not through spectacle, but through repetition that works. Christmas remains important because it fits into winter rather than defying it. It acknowledges hardship, pauses within it, then releases people back into necessary routine. The cold does not vanish completely. There will still be sharp mornings, late frosts, unexpected storms. But winter's authority weakens not dramatically, but reliably. Each day adds a little more light. Each night claims a little less. As you move forward, the habits formed in cold remain with you. Careful use of fuel, attention to one another, appreciation for warmth when it appears. These lessons persist beyond the season that taught them, and so the frozen feast of 1198 becomes part of something larger, not a story of suffering alone, nor of celebration alone, but of continuity. People endured, people adapted, people remembered. As you settle now, listening to the softened sounds of a world slowly shifting, you feel the tension ease from your body. Winter is still present, but it no longer feels endless. The fire glows low, breath slows, thoughts drift gently. You have walked through this season. You have felt its weight and its pause, and now at the edge of rest, you can let the images fade. The cold will pass, the light will return, and for tonight that is enough. The fire settles into embers, no longer demanding attention, just offering a quiet glow that fills the room without effort. Your body feels heavier now, but not from cold, from release. Muscles soften, breath deepens. The sounds that once seemed sharp blur into a steady hush. You no longer measure the night by hours or tasks. Time stretches gently, unimportant. Outside, winter continues its slow work, but it no longer presses so close. Inside, warmth lingers just enough to let your thoughts loosen their grip. Images from the season drift by without order. Snow underfoot, steam rising from a bowl, the low murmur of voices near a fire. None of them ask anything from you now. They simply pass like clouds moving across a dark sky. You are safe here. The night holds you without urgency. Nothing needs solving. Nothing needs preparing. You have done enough for one day, for one winter. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind quiet. Let the story fade where it wishes to fade. Sleep comes not as an ending, but as a continuation. Sweet dreams.